Welcome to POTUS 2017, where we keep watch on the Oval Office and pour cold, hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. This week, there's no shortage of flaming rhetoric to extinguish, including this presidential tweet. It accuses London's Muslim mayor, Sadiq Khan, of playing down terrorism, of saying there was no reason to be alarmed about the deadly terror attacks in his city. Only problem? Khan said no such thing. Rather, Khan warned Londoners that there was no reason to be alarmed about the increased police presence in the aftermath. Also needing a major correction this week, EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt's claim that the coal sector has been adding huge numbers of jobs, which, if true, would fulfill a Trump campaign promise to coal country voters.
In fact, since the fourth quarter of last year to most recently, added almost 50,000 jobs in the coal sector. In the month of May alone, almost 7,000 jobs.
Not quite. The BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, says the increase in coal jobs since the end of last year was not 50,000, but 1,300. And last month, not 7,000, but just 400. However, the BLS does fail to include coal-related jobs like truck drivers. That multiplier effect, plus adding in other kinds of mining, would significantly boost the number of new coal-related jobs, but still not near Pruitt's inflated numbers. And why are coal jobs rising, even modestly? Not clear, but an NPR report suggests it's an increased need for the kind of coal needed to make steel. Speaking of coal and tangling with European leaders, we will tackle two big topics today: the effect of President Trump's America First policies on Europe's future, and in our evidence-based policy segment, we'll examine a study promoting a more accurate, and we think alarming, way to calculate the effects of climate change. To begin, reverberations from President Trump's retreat from NATO and the Paris Climate Accords. Joining us, Professor Michael Williams, Director of NYU's Program in International Relations. And via Skype from Somerset in the UK, journalist Bill Emmott, former editor-in-chief of The Economist and author of a new book, The Fate of the West. Welcome, both of you. Thank you very much for joining us. Bill Emmott, let me start with you and go to something Angela Merkel said, the Chancellor of Germany, after Donald Trump was in Europe recently. She said, now we can't rely on others as much as before, something to that effect. How much do you think Europe does or did rely on the United States? And how much do we inflate our own role here as Americans?
I think that Europeans relied on America as a credible, reliable leader of the world. I think that Europeans felt that what America said, America actually meant and would carry on doing through thick and thin, regardless of what happened. And I think what's changed that Chancellor Merkel was trying to point up was this sense of credibility and reliability, that Europe can no longer not just be dependent on America. I don't think Europe was ever dependent on America, but rather Europe could no longer believe that America would be consistent in its policies and its stances.
Now, some people fear the rise in German power that might result if the United States becomes more isolationist. But earlier today, European historian Stephen Remy from CUNY told us via Skype it would be a good thing. Watch.
Germans are, I think, understandably irritated when they hear these immediate comparisons made to the Nazi period, as if the 60 years after 1945 counted for nothing. And they count for quite a bit. And I think for an Atlanticist like myself, it's a good thing that Germany has developed into a staunchly pro-European, pro-NATO political and diplomatic culture, that its politics are quite stable, and they have been for decades. Merkel is not facing populist challenge from either the left or the right on a scale of a Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump. Now, a lot could happen between now and late September when there are national elections in Germany. But the short answer is that yes to an increase in German influence and power, and that's a good thing.
Professor Williams, how much do you agree or disagree with Professor Remy?
I agree entirely. I've had the fortunate experience to live in Germany for 3 years. I worked in the German Ministry of Defense as a special advisor on a Bosch fellowship. And Germany is the most honest, apologetic country regarding its history. It has made the European Union and European integration a cornerstone of the new Federal Republic from '49 onwards, and of course after unification. And Germany will go through all lengths to preserve the EU because the EU legitimizes and makes German power palatable to its neighbors. And so in that sense, they are the best, most pro-Europeans, and they are traditionally very pro-Atlanticist. They've always looked to the United States. They've actually enjoyed limited sovereignty throughout much of the Cold War, relying on not just the US, but also a Franco-British approval, not to mention, of course, Soviet approval of unification. So they are used to coalitions, they're used to consensual politics, and there's nothing to fear in modern Germany in terms of a leadership role, and it's something that would actually be good for Europe and good for the United States, but unfortunate that it's coming in this manner.
Bill Emmott, there's a joke in the United States that says, oh, it was very important when Trump and Merkel got together because the leader of the free world met with the President of the United States. Do they make that joke in the UK, or do Brits see it that way?
Brits don't typically see it that way. I see it that way. But the British, because they're obsessed with Brexit, the process of leaving the European Union, don't quite know who to think is the leader of the free world. Maybe the Brits think the Brits are the leader of the free world. Actually, I think Europeans broadly, and I agree very much with the two previous speakers, want Germany to lead. They want Germany to take a far-sighted, generous policy approach to all sorts of European subjects, including trade, including climate change, including critically defense. And indeed has been accepting German leadership quite substantially in a way that Brits have tended not to.
Let me ask you a Brexit question then, because here in the United States at this point, most Americans see Donald Trump as a unrespectable face on American nationalism, the new nationalism. I'd say in France, we know after the election results there, most French people see Marine Le Pen as an unrespectable face on French nationalism. But in the UK, we had the Brexit vote. Maybe Nigel Farage also may be seen as an unrespectable face on British nationalism, or Boris Johnson. But now we've got Prime Minister Theresa May, who is sort of putting a respectable face on what globalists would consider an unrespectable policy. Why is she willing to do that?
I think that she believes, Prime Minister May believes, that a Britain independent of the European Union can be globalist, can be open, can be free, and that there is no contradiction in her minds between leaving the European Union and wanting to be one of the leaders of globalization. That places her in a very different place from President Trump. There are plenty of people in Britain, like Nigel Farage, who would consider a Britain first policy to be the right one, parallel to Donald Trump's America first. But Theresa May is not one of them. She is trying to navigate a path between some of the political forces that are swirling around her. But I would not say that she is primarily a Britain first person. She's a global person.
So, Professor Williams, how much would you say then that Britain is different, or Brexit is different, than Trumpism in the United States or Le Penism in France?
I would say Brexit has very different causes, some of which are legitimate regarding democratic deficits and legal issues of the European Union, some of which really revolve much more around the British myth of what Great Britain is. Throughout its history, Britain pursued a policy of offshore balancing, and the continent was a place that caused problems, and Britain intervened. Even the Second World War, again, it was sort of the British holding off the Nazi threat till the Americans came and then liberating the continent. So Britons have a different national story about their relationship to Europe, and that's part of what has fed this myth, in particular certain strands of English nationalism as well. And so there are some commonalities, frustration with sort of seemingly untrammeled immigration, despite the inaccuracies of that, concern over globalization and loss of jobs. But I would say that Brexit in the United Kingdom is very different from sort of the chauvinistic nationalism in the United States, even if there are some commonalities.
And what's your take on President Trump and NATO and his failure to articulate the words in Article 5? One report this week said the words were actually in his speech that he was to deliver that said, we reaffirm our commitment to Article 5, which means if any NATO member is attacked, the United States would consider it an attack on us and join in the defense. But then when it came to deliver the speech, he took it out.
Yeah.
Is that more or less meaningful than the press is making it seem?
I think it's more meaningful and very worrisome. First of all, the United States has really failed, I would say, to lead in NATO since Bill Clinton. He was the last U.S. president to visit NATO headquarters. And the Bush administration was very damaging to transatlantic relations. The Obama administration, quite frankly, didn't have time for Europe. And the president had quite a disdain for European Union politics and thought it was sort of done and dusted. And I think that the annexation of Crimea shows the folly of that way, and there were good voices in the administration they didn't listen to. So this is a longer-term trend, this agitation towards the United States and the abdication of American leadership. What worries me with Trump is, first of all, that he's so damaging, is so flamboyant. But there was a feeling of relief that Secretary of Defense Mattis and the National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster were the adults in the room, and they would temper the policies. And here we see that both of those men thought this line was in there. They had fought for that to be in there, and then he pulled it out. So those gentlemen in the room clearly don't have as much sway as many of us think, which is, of course, probably reasons for unsettled nights in the future.
But Bill Emmott, there are Americans, I would say on the left as well as on the right, who don't mind this part of Trump quite as much and think, well, wait a minute, we've spent a lot of blood as well as treasure jumping to the defense, or so we claimed it was the defense of countries in various parts of the world. And why exactly is it our business if Russia is involved in Crimea? Would it be Russia's business if the United States was involved in Mexico or the Dominican Republic? Why is it that we should commit young American men and women to go fight for Lithuania if they get into some kind of conflict? How do you see that?
Well, the way I see it is that we're all in the same position. British people wonder why we should commit British lives to fight in foreign conflicts, whether it's in the Balkans or in Africa or in Iraq. It's no different to the Americans. We believe in NATO because we believe in a cooperative, consensual approach to figuring out where to fight, where to intervene, what is in our collective interests as defenders of both international law and our own borders. And so we, as Europeans, think that America is integral to that process. By the way, I think that we still, in Europe, feel a sense of faith in America's belief in NATO. We do find President Trump's approach worrisome, but we do think that people like H.R. McMaster and General Mattis and the military establishment of the United States understands the purpose of NATO and understands that it needs to be preserved, perhaps beyond any given presidential term. But we just need to be able to supplement it with our own activities through a European Union cooperative defense project.
Professor Williams, let me pivot to another hotspot in the world that I think Americans this week are finding almost inexplicable. And that is, well, the Middle East always is inexplicable in various ways to a lot of people, but ISIS, we can understand, kinda, why they would attack London, why they would attack Paris, why they would attack America. ISIS took responsibility for an attack on the Iranian parliament and on the shrine of Ayatollah Khomeini there. And the average American who's not steeped in the minutiae of ISIS will think, wait, these are the two entities in the world that really want to be ruled by Sharia law. Why did ISIS attack these, holy and politically iconic sites of Tehran, of all places?
Well, there are splits, of course, within Islam and within the Middle East. You have geopolitical splits between the Saudis, the Iranians, the Qataris now, as we see. There are religious splits between Sunni and Shia, Iran being the great Shia power of the region, the Saudis being the great Sunni power, and particularly spreading Wahhabist ideology, which is infiltrated into the Taliban and early into Al-Qaeda. It is very much evident in some of the more extremist thinking within ISIS. So they are not on the same side as the Iranians, and they are certainly striking from within this internal discord within the religious diaspora in that region, not to mention the geopolitical sort of tendencies and forces that are funding and pushing sort of certain extremists in different directions. So for the Iranians, they are just as concerned about the instability that ISIS and the idea of the caliphate under that leadership poses to them, as well as other powers in the region.
And Qatar, is it that they're funding ISIS in some way, that Saudi Arabia, Sunni on Sunni, is breaking off diplomatic relations?
The situation with Qatar is phenomenal and bizarre. That the United States and the president in particular has pointed the finger at Qatar as funding extremism. They are very close to Hamas, which we know. At the same time, the Saudis have a very long record of funding extremism in the Middle East, in South Asia, and elsewhere. At the same time, so fine, both are guilty of that. We have major basing interests and Air Force basing in Qatar and rely on that as a hub of operations against ISIS, not to mention power projection in the Middle East. So for the president to sort of upend the calculus and allow the Saudis to corral other powers in the region against the Qataris and cut them off, as well as our own condemnation, seems to really cut against the U.S. national interest. And I have no doubt that there are several individuals at the Department of Defense very concerned about what this might mean for ongoing operations in the region.
Well, thanks very much to both of you. And regarding climate change policy, let's bring on some additional evidence. Time for evidence-based politics, where we pour cold, hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. In this case, rhetoric about an overheated planet. It turns out the 2015 Paris Climate Accord was unfair to the USA in Donald Trump's eyes.
I was elected to represent the citizens of Pittsburgh, not Paris.
Perhaps Pittsburgh was not the best example for the president to pick. Its mayor, Bill Emmott, said Trump's decision was disastrous. He and 1,200 other mayors, governors, and businesses have pledged to work toward the Paris climate goals. Still, millions of Americans, including Vice President Pence, don't seem to accept that there's urgency.
For some reason or another, this issue of climate change has emerged as a paramount issue for the left in this country and around the world.
Not clear any facts would change some minds, but still, could climate scientists make a more compelling case? A new article in the journal Science argues yes. If scientists could consistently make clear what will happen to the planet soon, as well as, say, 100 years from now. The article was authored by a team of scientists from Harvard, Princeton, and the Environmental Defense Fund. It's titled Unmask Temporal Trade-Offs in Climate Policy Debates. One of the authors, Ilissa Ocko, joined us on Skype from Cambridge, Maryland. She is a climate scientist for the Environmental Defense Fund. Dr. Ocko, thank you very much for joining us. Hello.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And Michael Williams from NYU's Foreign Policy Department stays with us. Dr. Ocko, the subtitle of your article is both 20 and 100-year timescales should always be reported. What exactly are you referring to there with those timescales, and how does that language affect policy or the general understanding of the climate threat?
Well, we really need to create better climate policy for today's generation as well as generations to come. And so when we talk about near-term climate change, we're really talking about just within a couple of decades, and that's around 20 years. And then when we talk about long-term climate change, which we also care about because we don't want catastrophic events to happen for generations to come, then we're thinking more in terms of 100 years.
So what's an example of a 20-year argument that might be more relatable than ones that scientists are commonly using today?
A lot of the decisions that we make are based on shorter timescales. If we think about people in office, they're often only there for several years. And so when they make decisions, they're thinking about things that affect us over the next 5, 10 years, not 100 years down the road. So it's a way for policymakers to really understand what is affecting the climate in the near term so that we can take action to address that during our lifetimes.
And we have a chart that we're going to put up that you shared with us that explains the difference of the timescales of different pollutants. Can you tell us what we're looking at here?
Absolutely. So not all pollutants are created equal. They're all different in the amount of energy that they trap and how long they last in terms of how much we emit into the atmosphere. And all these properties change how one of these pollutants impacts the climate. And so when we look at the first characteristic, how much energy does a pollutant trap? Well, looking at black carbon, which is at the top left corner of this diagram, which is BC in the light blue, what this graph shows you is that it is 1,000,000 times more effective at trapping energy in the climate system than carbon dioxide is, which is at the lower right-hand corner in red. So you'd think, well, then we really care about black carbon because it's so effective at trapping energy. But then you look at how long black carbon lasts, and it only lasts about a week in the atmosphere. So the CO2 that we emit may be weakly absorbing energy, but it lasts for hundreds of years in the atmosphere. So every time we emit CO2, we are committing our planet to warming for centuries to come. And just as an example, 40% of the CO2 that we emitted in World War I is still in the atmosphere today. Oh. So that's why we care about these long-lived climate pollutants, because they commit us to warming for a long time.
Dr. Ocko, could you give us some examples over the 20-year horizon of things that could happen, say, in the United States on the eastern seaboard or elsewhere around the world that would be tangible things that we could relay to voters and also policymakers about the consequences of an action?
Absolutely. So we've already seen sea level rise of over 1/2 foot since the Industrial Revolution. And that may not seem like a lot to people, but that during high tide can flood cities. And we've seen that. And we've seen beaches being eroded in Miami, Florida. And so the sea level will continue rising, especially in the next couple of decades. And so those impacts will get worse. Extreme weather events, as we keep emitting pollutants and we have more warming in the near term, a lot of extreme weather events can get more frequent, they can last longer, or they can get more intense. So those are things that are really important for our everyday life. And then you also think about all the animals and plants that aren't able to keep up when the warming is at a really fast pace.
How much uncertainty, Dr. Ocko, do you see here? The EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt, Trump's appointee, said on TV this week that he believes climate warming is happening, that humanity does contribute to it. But beyond that, there is massive scientific uncertainty as to how much humanity is contributing to it, and therefore how necessary it is to spend a lot of money on energy transformation. How would you frame the question of uncertainty?
We are as certain that humans cause climate change as we are about gravity and that smoking causes cancer.
Period.
Pretty certain.
Period.
And the effects?
This is nearly unanimous among scientists worldwide at independent institutions across all countries.
Causes how much? Because he said causes some, but not clear how much.
If we look at the long-term 100-year trend of warming patterns in the world, it's pretty much almost 100% of that warming signal is coming from human activities. When you look at a 5-year period, for example, natural cycles like El Nino definitely play a role and can contribute to warming or detract from warming. But when we look at the 100-year record, it's pretty much all humans.
And Professor Williams, on the policy itself, even if the warming science is accepted, Trump spins it in economic terms, that no matter what your position on climate science, this was also a treaty or an accord that was intended to get a lot of foreign aid for developing countries out of the West to help them develop with renewables, which is in the treaty. And it's also a way for Europe and maybe China and India to weaken the competitive advantage of the United States in the marketplace because of the restrictions on us compared to them. Is that not a reality in addition to the climate science of what this was about?
Trump's argument is rubbish, quite frankly. There are going to be some drawbacks economically for the United States and other developed countries to sort of curb carbon emissions and address a greener economy. However, this is for our own immediate and long-term good. And there are also massive economic incentives to do so. Look at Tesla Motors, for an example, which is an example of a burgeoning industry that is doing very well on a green economy. And there are more and more sciences, more and more industries that are going to be springing up. So rather than focusing on some of the costs that this will entail, costs that are really something we need to expend in order to preserve our own habitat and ensure our own survival, there's a lot of benefits here. And the locus of this in Europe and elsewhere was not to disadvantage the United States, but it was to really create the conditions necessary to get this under control.
Dr. Ocko, does it help that 1,200 different mayors and governors and businesses are going against Trump on this? Does it make a dent?
Yes, it absolutely makes a dent. We can get a lot done with U.S. cities, U.S. states, and many companies across the country. We could get even more done with the federal government on board and even more done with the whole world on board.
Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Ocko. Professor Williams, thank you. And that's POTUS 2017 for today. We're here each week at this hour, pouring cold hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.